Welcome back, everyone. So, what have we got in store today? Well, you probably know because you already read the title on YouTube, didn't you? But never mind. If you joined me last time, we did a rough carve on the back of this neck, and I have to say it went well, a lot better than I expected. It's kind of down to the stage now where I should be able to maybe tweak the end of the heel, tweak the end of the neck with a file, and then resort to hand sanding. And I mean, it's already feeling almost acceptable in the hand. There's the odd little lump and bump, but it's very, very subtle. A little bit of sanding will sort that out, no problem whatsoever. Now, as far as that job's concerned, the next thing to do would be to do exactly that. Take a file and some sandpaper to the back of that neck and get it all finished and lovely. However, what I have already mentioned is that I'm not entirely happy with some of my fret slots, and it's completely the wrong time to come to that realization because I've already bound the neck, which is unfortunate to say the least. Let me show you just how off they can be. The fret ruler that I've been using is actually, it's not really a fret ruler. It's actually something that's designed to have the fretboard placed on top of it and then put through my mitre box, which has a little pin in it. And that little pin hooks into these notches and you just move it along one notch at a time. And when you cut through the mitre box, it cuts all your slots perfectly in the right position. Unfortunately, I didn't really do that at the time. I more or less hand cut everything, and I've been a little bit off with my cutting, which is really unfortunate. I will definitely be using the mitre box on my future builds. But for the time being, I mean, it was the first job that I did the fretboard, and I just should have took my time maybe a little bit more with it. It is actually very tricky to cut perfectly straight down to that level of accuracy. It's something I'm probably still going to struggle with when I try and do it for a second time. So how badly did I do? Well, in order to find out, what I did was I redrew a centre line on the fretboard, and then I also drew some lines parallel to the centre line, because remember the neck tapers a little bit, so I used the centre line as a guide. I drew two parallel lines quite close to the edge of the fretboard, and then I basically placed my fret slot with its little notches. I placed that firstly on the centre line with the nut right in the centre of the notch, and then I went along and looked at how I'd done. Now, the notches on this are 2mm in width, and all of the fret slots are within that 2mm. They all fall within the slots of the fret ruler, which is good at least. But once we get down to the top end of the neck, at least, certainly, or the bottom end of the neck, depending on which way you look at it, beyond the 12th fret, 1 or 2mm can make all the difference to your intonation, and some of them just aren't quite good enough. So what I've done is I've placed an X on any slot where the existing slot at the moment is closer to the outside edge of the slot on the ruler rather than the centre. That means anything that is outside of about 0.5 mil to 1 mil accuracy is getting marked. I did that down the centre line, and then I did that down each of the outside lines as well, because remember, I could in theory get the centre of the fret bang on where it's supposed to be, but if I tilt the saw slightly, then the ends of the fret slot could be completely out of position. So when I've done that, I'll show you a quick pass. Just tilt that so the light reflects off the pencil. You can see there's a few frets where every point, both sides and the centre, like here, are off. And I think that's the 7th, the 9th. There's a few of them. and it certainly gets worse down the bottom end of the fretboard. There's also a few, particularly at this end of the fretboard, where the centre's okay, but then on the very edge it's off. Strangely, there are some where the centre and the edge are off at one side. Sorry, the centre and the edge are okay at one side, but then on one side it's off. So I must have just kind of made a rocking motion with the saw and tilted slightly as I've done it. Very tricky stuff. But what can I do about this? Well, ultimately, I mean, yes, an argument could be made that given how far off I am, which is not a lot, I could in theory go ahead and fret the thing, and then when I come to crown the frets I can kind of try and adjust slightly, but I think that where madness lies, to be honest. I'm going to have to fill and recut some of these fret slots. What it does mean when I cut through and make the new fret slots, I'm going to be cutting through my binding. Now, in this case, that's not actually as bad as it seems. I could have tried to take the binding off, but I know that if I do that, half the palm wood's going to come with it, so I'm just not even going to try and do that. If I cut straight through the binding, then because the tolerance is so close, when I actually come to put the frets in, they will entirely cover the top of the fret slot. They'll entirely cover the top of the binding, particularly that white line that runs along the edge. And it should mean that you don't actually notice there are any gaps in the binding on the top. On the side, however, obviously we'll have some fret slot holes. Those, I'm just going to have to fill them with dust and glue. Now, people quite often go along the edge of their fretboards when they don't do binding and fill those with dust and glue anyway, and you get mixed results, but on ebony it's not very noticeable at all. So I'm kind of hoping that if I'm heavy on the dust, it should be indistinguishable or close enough that we don't get upset about it. So how am I going to fill my fret slots? Well, the best way to do it probably would be to get some ebony veneer and actually fill in those slots as if it was a fretless, or as if I was converting it to a fretless. People often do that, they will fill those with veneer. There's no way in hell my bandsaw is going to cut veneers that thin, and I think even if I went and bought some veneers online, the narrowest I'd probably get is about 1/2 mil thick, and even then probably not going to fit in those fret slots. So that's out the window. We're basically down to dust and glue again. Now, I've heard of a lot of people just filling the fret slots with glue, pretty much, and nothing else. Appearance-wise, it's not really going to matter too much because it's going to be entirely covered by the new frets. So I'm not really too fussed about how it looks. I think I'm going to have to put in a layer of pretty much pure super glue at first, just to seep right down into the slot. I think then I will pack a little bit of dust in on top and then go for either another layer of glue on top of the fret slot or a pre-mixture of dust and glue along the slot. Now, having done something similar to this before, I am aware that super glue in particular shrinks when it's dry. So any slots we do fill in, we're actually going to have to fill them in slightly proud, but we want to be as neat as possible in doing that because a dust and glue combo makes for very tough sanding, and we don't want to have to really go to town with the sander to clean this up after we do the filling in. We also want to bear in mind as well that when I come to cut the fret slots, the difference in hardness between the ebony and the dust and glue is potentially cause for concern, but there's not really a lot I can do about that. So, wish me luck. I'm not going to be able to talk too much during this because I want to work fast while the glue's wet. So, here we go. really do with is some of those precision applicator tips and probably slightly thinner viscosity glue. As usual, just sort of working with what I've got on the day. Well, that was messier than it needed to be, and I didn't really stick to the plan with the dust and glue. I definitely recommend anyone trying to do this for themselves, you want thin viscosity glue and you want some applicator tips for certain. But we'll leave that to dry just for a little while, and then we'll come back and try and sand it and see what it looks like. Maybe that we have to do a little bit of refilling maybe. It may look terrible, it may look brilliant. Who knows?
Approximately 10 hours later.
Whew, well, it's pretty hard work sanding through dust and glue. It's like concrete, but we're getting there. I don't know if you can see on the higher frets, still a little bit left to take off, but the colour match is very good at least. On the frets further down the neck, there's still quite a prominent bump that I need to sand through, and it's taking quite some time. So I think I'm going to leave it there today, come back tomorrow and carry on.
The next day.
Right, we're back, it's a new day. And you can see where I've sandpapered previously. Let me zoom in for you. Now, if I actually start at the other end of the fretboard, here's probably the best example of what it's going to look like when it's fully sanded down. There's a little bit left to sand on the edge there. So as you can see, if you look really closely, there's the faintest of lines. It's not really a different colour from the rest of the fretboard. I think you can only really notice it because it interrupts the grain of the fretboard, but you really have to look super close in order to see it, which is why ebony's quite good for this kind of thing, because it really doesn't show up that kind of thing too bad. You can see over here, this one's not quite sanded down flush yet, but it's getting there. But once we get down towards the other end of the fretboard, I think I was a little bit overcautious in how much material I put on top. I was a little bit worried about shrinkage, and I didn't want to have to come back and put more on top and sand back again. Unfortunately though, dust and glue is very, very hard. It's harder than wood to sand by quite some margin. So trying to go through that with a radius block and sandpaper is taking forever. So what I'm probably going to do is actually take some files to it and just see if I can get the worst of it off before carrying on with the sanding. Have also noticed as well, particularly here, there's a couple of spots where I haven't actually managed to quite fill in the slots, so I'm going to have to refill those anyway. But I'm still going to take the worst of this lot off first and see what it leaves us with, because you never know, there could be gaps underneath where I haven't quite managed to get material in the slots properly or anything like that. But I'm thankful that I can see, especially when we look at say this one up top, that it's not going to be obvious at all when we do any filling on the ebony, which is great. Oh well, time to put in some elbow grease with the file. I'm not feeling particularly great today, but we'll soldier on. Switch to the finer file because we're getting closer to the fretboard. So hopefully you can see there, I was just using a second cut graded file to take most of that material off. Obviously it still looks patchy at the minute because it needs sanded down. There are still, as I say, those little holes to fill in, but I think I'm just going to give those patches a quick going over with the radius block, just so we can kind of keep track of where we are.
Approximately 10 hours later.
So there we go. Give it a little bit of a clean up. You can see there are some slots missing presently. It still looks a little bit more patchy down this end because there's still a little bit more sanding off to do, but it's nearly there. And as I say, we've still got the odd little slot which actually needs a little bit more filling. So I'm going to have another round of filling on those before we go any further with the sanding. Right, so I think that's had long enough to dry. Let's sand that off a bit as well. I think again, should I go for the file first or should I see what the sand block's like? We'll try sanding. Yeah, right. We'll file those, I think. That looks good to me. Just going to try and neaten it up a little bit with the sanding block again. there we have it. If you look dead on at this angle in that light, you can just make out where the fret slots were, but they're barely noticeable at all. And you will see there's still a few little bits like this where it's like sheen from the super glue, but that does just sand straight off. But bear in mind, I still need to do kind of a final finish on this fretboard. There's also still a little bit of dirt in there that needs cleaned out, but I'm going to have to do that job several times before we're finished. But no, that's looking really good. Now, what I would have liked to have done at this point is actually go ahead and cut the new slots. But to be honest with you, I mean, the light's starting to fade. I've got a bit of a headache. It's really not the best conditions to be doing such an accurate job. I've already messed it up once, so I think I'm going to do the sensible thing and call it a day there for now. This video is probably already long enough, so I think I'll release it now as is, and then we'll do the fret slots next time. If in the meantime anyone has any thoughts, opinions or advice on how to cut fret slots accurately, by all means chip in. The only other thing I would say, which I forgot to mention actually, is yes, while these lines are slightly visible, you have to remember they're all within a tolerance where they're ultimately going to be under the correct fret anyway. The slot will be slightly off, probably even cut slightly into the side of some of them. But they will be ultimately covered by the fret. The only thing I'm slightly worried about is, as I mentioned earlier, the super glue and wood combo is harder than the actual wood, so if cutting on the boundary between the two, it may have a tendency to push the saw. We're just going to have to be really careful and see how we get on. But no, it's looking pretty good to me. I get fairly excited when I look at the neck now, because it really is looking like a neck. You know what? There's one thing that I forgot to mention in the past videos as well, for those who are following the build regularly. There is actually a tiny little hole there. You see it? And that is where I was obviously a bit vicious with the drill when I was trying to do the little chamber for routing, getting the truss rod hole under there. Whoops. So I will need to fill that in with dust and glue at some point as well. One last thought actually, the Magnuson files that I got, 9-piece set, complete with I think it, what was this? It was I think it was 3 rasps and 4 second cut files, and also a brush for cleaning them as well. Very happy with those. I'm liking the way a second cut file works through the wood. If anyone out there is thinking about getting files to work with wood, I think second cut is definitely probably about the right grade for this kind of work. It's rough enough that you can noticeably take material off, but it's not too violent and it's not going to cause tear out because it's fairly fine. Anyway, I think that's enough for today. I shall see you next time. Goodbye.